Hey, how's it going, friends? Thank you for tuning in to VR Revelations. So I have another video update here on the situation in the city of Soledar, which is, of course, a very strategic city right now that, according to reports, and as I covered in my previous videos, is under Russian control. Uh, According to these reports, it seems that there are Russian soldiers still somewhere inside the city. They are encircled, but these soldiers are continue to, hold a resistance there and are pretty much waiting for some sort of offensive from outside the city by the Ukrainians so that they can be rescued. But a lot of these soldiers are getting killed because they are encircled. Also, we have Ukrainian soldiers that are hiding in the massive salt mine system there in the city who might also be waiting for a rescue from an offensive by the Ukrainian military. Now, I'm going to read from two articles here. One is from War News 24/7, which is a Greek website that is covering the situation or the war that is taking place right now in Ukraine. I also have a report here from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which is, pro-Ukrainian, a Western news source for all of those of you who, doubt these foreign reporters, foreign reports. So we'll take a look at both articles there. They're sort of talking about the same thing right now, this offensive that was launched by the Ukrainians, or rather the stance that the Ukrainians are making. The article from 24/7 News does touch on apparently an offensive that was launched here to try and rescue those Ukrainian forces inside of the city that actually failed, and according to the article here, resulted in 200 dead elite Ukrainian soldiers when they met the resistance of the Russian soldiers there in Soledar. So I've gone through the article. Of course, I'm not going to read both articles all the way through. That would literally make this video about an hour long. But you can go check out these articles again here at this website, War News 24/7. You'll have to click translate there on Google so it can translate it from Greek to English. And the other article here is from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. So let me just give you a brief recap here on what the articles are talking about here. So again, guys, I'm not for Russia nor for Ukraine, right? I am a Christian. I believe that everything going on right now is going to result in World War III and the end of the world, when eventually all of this spirals out of control and leads to a nuclear conflict. And again, you don't have to be religious to understand that a nuclear conflict means the end of the world. I have a video talking about the power of nuclear weapons. Go look it up. It's called The End Signs of the End Times Nuclear Weapons. I might make another video on just how these nuclear superpowers can literally destroy the world with their nuclear arsenal. But anyways, what I do is like I just showed you, I take a look at multiple news sources, then I extrapolate where they seem to agree, and then based on video and other information, I come to a conclusion. Both sides will try and be biased for their agenda. They might try to exaggerate their claims. But as we can see here from this live UA map, which is pro-Ukrainian, they are reporting on this situation right now. And you can see that all of this red is what Russia has under control. We understand that Russia has annexed all these regions. They are now legally Russian territory, like on paper. Now, you might be pro-Ukrainian, but you can't dispute that. Even the Western media news sources agree, as you can see here, that this is under Russian control. You might not want to accept reality and pretend that this isn't under Russian control, but that is the truth. Both sides are reporting on it. According to all the other witnesses and evidence, this seems to be the reality of the world that we live in, guys. Again, you might not want to accept that or deny it or argue with somebody about it, but it's undeniable. This is what this is the truth. This is what both sides are reporting. The Russians are advancing into Ukraine. Now, Western media news sources can say, "Oh, the Ukrainians are inflicting massive casualties for every inch that the Russians gain ground." Okay, that's you can attribute that to the bias, right, to the propaganda. But the reality of the matter is that they are advancing. They are taking over cities. And so the city that they seem to have just recently taken control of here is Soledar, which is a very strategic city because it has a massive salt mine system that, you know, the whatever military is there can use to their advantage. As of right now, we have Ukrainian soldiers in those mines that, again, are sort of trapped in there because the Russians, according to multiple sources, have taken control of the whole city. Now, Soledar is very important because, as you can see on this map, here is Soledar. Once Soledar is completely under Russian control, meaning that, you know, they can start planning their next attack, they can move towards Bakhmut. Now, Bakhmut is a very symbolic point of resistance for Ukraine right now. But the reason that the Ukrainians are fighting tooth and nail right now to try and recapture Soledar is because once Soledar collapses, you can see here that Bakhmut will be exposed to the Russian army from the north, from an attack from Soledar, and then they will also be exposed to the south because, again, as we see in the live UA map down here, the Russians also control the territory down here on the south of Bakhmut. Here's Soledar, here's Bakhmut. Also, as we'll see in the report here from War News 24/7, the Russians are making, they're trying to encircle Zveresk city right up here. So once they take control of Soledar, rather they already have control of Soledar, but once they clear out the Ukrainian forces here and take control of Zveresk, then they will be able to launch an attack from the north of Bakhmut down here. And as is pretty evident here, you'll see that they can very easily launch a pincer movement right from the south and from the north of Bakhmut, where they will encircle Bakhmut just as they did with Soledar. And once Bakhmut collapses, this will be a major turning point in this area because the next closest major cities are Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, which are all the way back here. So this leaves all this piece of land for the taking of the Russian military, and they'll be able to advance forward here rather quickly and continue the fight in these next two major cities. Now, according to this article, War News 24/7, from what I read, the speculation now seems to be that because Soledar is so important to the survival of Bakhmut, or to the Ukrainian resistance there in Bakhmut, they are trying to rescue the forces that are trapped in Soledar, and so they launched a sort of minor offensive, which failed and resulted in 200 dead Ukrainian soldiers, which were trained by the British, and so these were supposed to be elite forces that were trying to rescue the Ukrainian soldiers trapped in the mines there in Soledar, and also the Ukrainians that are fighting in the center of the city that are encircled. So now, what the Russians essentially are wondering is if Ukraine is going to launch some sort of major offensive here on Soledar, because, again, if Soledar falls, Bakhmut will be at risk of collapse and encirclement down here. So you see some articles now that are trying to downplay the importance of Soledar, but they don't understand the situation, right? They're just trying to minimize, the reports of the losses for Ukraine. But it is very evident by the ferociousness with which the Ukrainians are trying to, make some sort of resistance here in Soledar, just how strategic the city really is to the survival of Bakhmut here in this whole region, which I gotta say seems to be getting ready to collapse under complete Russian control here. I think that is what is going to happen. But the question is now, will Ukraine launch a major offensive? There are reports that they are building up resistance or in units here in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, which would be the next cities in line, right, for major battles. But the suspicion is that they might send here, their army here from Kramatorsk and Slavyansk towards Soledar and launch a major offensive to try and push the Russian military out of Soledar and retake the city, and therefore prevent the collapse of Bakhmut down here. Because again, if Bakhmut collapses, that's going to be a big time loss. The Western media news sources are going to have to report on that. Now, isn't it interesting that we haven't heard much about Ukraine lately on CNN, on Fox News, on all Western media? Why haven't they reported on the situation down there? Literally for like a month, they haven't reported. We saw a couple of months ago last year when Ukraine launched an offensive, they were reporting on it and touting that, the Ukrainians were pushing back and that they were getting close to the Russian border. But ever since then, they've literally gone silent, right? Now, they've been sending billions of dollars, right, in armaments and weapons and defensive weapons. So we know that this is a big deal for them. But interestingly enough, they're not reporting on the situation. Why could that be? Because they have nothing positive to report about. And if they do, they'd have to make up a bunch of lies, which they're not willing to do because they're easily able to pretty much, I guess, discredit all that information, or rather, bring the truth to light. So they don't want to report on anything because they know that they have nothing, no good news to report on. And, that should say something. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. So, that is the situation right now. The Russians have control of Soledar. There are Ukrainian forces trapped in the middle of the city. There are Ukrainian forces trapped inside the salt mines. The Ukrainians just tried to launch an offensive, sort of a rescue mission with elite forces to try and rescue their units in Soledar. That offensive failed. And now the Russians are sort of just trying to clear out the city and trying to make a decision as to what they're going to do with the situation in the mines, with the Ukrainian soldiers in the mines. And also, they're sort of waiting to see if Ukraine is going to launch an offensive here with their military units that are in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. So if they do travel all the way here across this land towards Soledar, then the Russians are going to have to prepare for that offensive. Now, if they do launch an offensive from those cities in order to try and recapture Soledar to prevent an encirclement of Bakhmut, and which could result in a catastrophic defeat there in this whole area, then the thing is that if this offensive is launched by the Ukrainians into Soledar and it is successful, that will bring up the morale of its troops, and it'll be sort of it'll be sort of a small defeat for the Russians, and it will be a roadblock, right? They'll have to regroup again, and then they'll have to try and take the city of Soledar again. But just how willing are the Ukrainians ready to launch an offensive on Soledar? Do they actually have the energy, the manpower right now to risk such an offensive for Soledar in order to try and retain that area there and Bakhmut? Or are they just going to play it defensively and let Soledar pretty much fall under Russian control and then now risk Bakhmut being encircled? I think that's the most likely, because, again, if they do launch an offensive here into Soledar and it fails, that's going to demoralize the Ukrainian military even more. That's going to precipitate the collapse of Bakhmut. And then the Russians are going to be on a high morale, and they're going to probably launch their attack on Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. Now, if that were to happen, that could coincide with the large offensive that is being rumored by the Ukrainians and by the British. Apparently, they suspect that, as I reported in my last video, with this new commander that took control of the situation there in Ukraine, the expectation is that here in the next couple of weeks, at the most within the next 2 months, Russia will launch a major offensive aimed at the capital of Ukraine, and what could be a decisive turning point in the war here and a precipitation of the complete collapse of Ukraine. Now, we know that the Ukrainians are receiving more defensive weapons and some tanks from, I believe, Germany, and I'm not sure if it was Spain or France. But, you know, they are receiving some armaments. However, it's coming a little too late, and the Ukrainians need much more than this. You can't win a war defensively, right? At some point, you know, the enemy keeps advancing, or the Russians in this case, you have to push back, and the Ukrainians really are not doing that. They just keep fighting for control of these cities. They keep claiming that they are inflicting massive casualties on the Russians, all the while the Russians keep advancing. Now, the suspicion is here that in this major offensive, the Russians could launch an attack also from Belarus. Some are, some are predicting that the Belarus army could join in the fight, which again would be catastrophic for the Ukrainian government there, and I think it would be a death blow. But either way, if this major offensive does come from Belarus also, this could be the death blow, and I think that is coming this year. This year, we're gonna see the, not, I wouldn't say the end of the war, right? Because even if Russia takes control of Kyiv, they got all this area down here where the Ukrainian army can fall back to with the support of these countries and sort of continue the conflict here. But if Kyiv does collapse, then that can literally pretty much, it'll be like a symbol of the end of the war, right? Of the end of this special mission operation. And so that would make international news. It would be a national embarrassment for the United States and for NATO and for Ukraine. But at the end of the day, guys, I think that, the U.S. and NATO aren't willing to risk nuclear war. So eventually, I think that Kyiv will fall to the Russians. I think there is no other option. Zelensky isn't willing to negotiate, even though the Russians continue to advance. Zelensky keeps claiming that they're going to take back all this territory, which is contrary to the reality of the situation. The Americans and NATO are not willing to send their best weapons into Ukraine. And again, if they didn't send them at the beginning of the conflict before Russia had control of this, why would they send them now when the situation is even worse? It just wouldn't make any sense. But anyways, let me just read a little bit from both articles here, just so you can get the information from these news sources also, and not just out of my mouth. So as you can see here, a rapid advance of Russian forces towards Severodonetsk has been recorded since the morning in an attempt to maintain the momentum after the capture of Soledar. Now again, I showed you Severodonetsk is up here. They're trying to take control of this town where they can reinforce their capture of Soledar down here. And then the next objective would be the symbolic strategic center here for Ukraine, Bakhmut, where they would plan to encircle the city here and again take control of Bakhmut there, which would send pretty much all the Ukrainian forces back here to these next major cities, Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. So it continues here. Russian forces have already taken the Vasily settlement and entered Rozdalivka. The Russian troops from Soledar were scattered, it says, but again, this is a translation. I think they meant to say they were sort of, extended throughout the city. Paratroopers and elements of the 10th Guards Motorized Division advanced towards Zveresk and entered Vasily after heavy fighting. Vasily is located, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, Vasily is located north of Soledar. In the area, Russian troops defeated the 118th Cherkasy Territorial Brigade. At the same time, information indicates that Russian forces are also entering the settlement of Rozdilivka. Ukrainian forces are trying to entrench themselves in the center of the village in an attempt to take advantage of the urban area. The Russians are moving full speed towards the encirclement of Zveresk. On the Soledar front, the Ukrainians launched a counterattack which collapsed. The 46th and 77th Airborne Brigades attempted to break the Russian encirclement at Soledar. So again, Soledar is under Russian control. They have the city encircled, but there are still Ukrainian soldiers in the city. They are trapped, and the Ukrainians tried to rescue them with this small offensive here. These are elite forces trained by Britain, so we see the British involvement there in the training of the units. Battles are limited to the Silch station in the northwest Soledar and salt mine number 7. So we have some video here of soldiers in the trenches. You can go take a look yourself here on War News 24/7 at those videos. I think I've shown those videos before. I don't think they are exactly related to the news here on this offensive. Ukrainian counterattack crashes, 200 dead. So here's the information on this counterattack here. The command of the armed forces of Ukraine tried to organize a counterattack to stop the advance of the private military corporation Wagner assault groups on Soledar and break the Russian encirclement. The Ukrainians tried to free their forces, but the counterattack ended in a crash. More specifically, on the morning of January 10th, again right now, as of the making of this video, it is January 12th, the year of our Lord 2023. So we see here, more specifically, on the morning of January 10th, the Vostok Command of the Armed Forces of Ukraine tried to organize a counterattack to break the encirclement and help the remnants of Ukrainian troops to leave Soledar. So they tried to rescue the soldiers there, and they couldn't break the encirclement of the city, and they failed. The forces of the 46th and 77th Brigades of the Armed Forces of Ukraine participated in the operation. Although their personnel were very few and their artillery was destroyed by Russian airstrikes and MLRS. Despite being outnumbered by 200 and 300 men, both brigades counterattacked. Covering fire was to be provided by the 17th Separate Tank Brigade and the remaining artillery, but this was not possible. So it looks like the Ukrainians tried to launch this counteroffensive while they were outnumbered, which resulted in a failed attempt. So very brave, but very risky there, and it resulted in a loss of about 200 soldiers, according to the report here. In addition, the units of the armed forces of Ukraine thrown into the counterattack did not have commanders at the level of company battalion. Only French VA-B armored personnel carriers and the British Wolfhound anti-mine armored personnel carriers were available. However, this did not help them either. In general, the counterattack attempt failed. 200 soldiers were killed. The remnants of the 46th and 77th Brigades retreated. So, again, this small-scale counteroffensive here to rescue the Ukrainian soldiers in Soledar failed. If you go on and continue to read the article, you'll see that they pretty much start speculating on the possibility of the Ukrainians trying to launch an even bigger rescue mission, or rather an offensive here on Soledar, because again, if Soledar falls, Bakhmut is next. And if Bakhmut falls, this is a catastrophic loss in this whole area, and they will have to retreat to Kramatorsk and Slovyansk to continue the fighting. But now, if you continue to read the article, they speculate that the Ukrainians might choose to regroup here in Kramatorsk, Slovyansk, gather their units, their soldiers, and launch a major offensive towards Soledar. But the risk here that the Ukrainians have to weigh is that if this offensive fails, if they do decide to launch an offensive there for Soledar and it fails, that's going to be a huge loss of soldiers. It'll be very demoralizing, so that will only precipitate the collapse of Bakhmut and then the advance of the Russian soldiers on this whole area towards Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, on top of the rumors of a large imminent offensive. So there we have the report from War News 24/7. Let's jump over to a Western media news source here from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Let's just take a quick read on what they have to say here. So it says, Ukrainian troops hold eastern town of Soledar despite Russian onslaught, Deputy Minister says. Ukrainian forces are still holding out in the eastern mining town of Soledar despite a massive Russian onslaught. Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister said late on January 10th after the British Defense Ministry said that Russian forces had likely captured most of the town. Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar said in a statement that heavy fighting to hold on to Soledar continued, but Ukrainian fighters were bravely defending the town. The enemy disregards the heavy losses of its personnel and continues to storm actively, Maliar said. The approaches to our positions are simply strewn with the bodies of dead enemy fighters, she said. So again, that's where you can attribute those statements to the Western propaganda. It seems that every time Ukraine is losing hold of their positions, the reports are always that they're inflicting massive casualties on the Russians while at the same time losing control of these cities. It's that old World War II belief that, or idea that, these Russians are just throwing bodies at the front lines. They're just rushing these machine guns, but their numbers are just too overwhelming for the Allies, right? So the article continues here. The head of Russia's Wagner mercenary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, late on January 10, claimed his forces had taken control of the town, TASS said. But in a statement quoted by Reuters, he said fighting was still going on in a cauldron in the center of the city. The number of prisoners will be announced tomorrow, he added, giving no further details. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty cannot corroborate specific battlefield claims. Capturing Soledar and its salt mines would have symbolic, military, and commercial value for Russia and would be Moscow's most substantial gain in months. Okay, now that's honest reporting right there. That's exactly why Soledar is so important. And not only that, not only would it be very symbolic, but as I've shown you, this would be catastrophic for Bakhmut, who itself is very symbolic, a very symbolic city, a very symbolic point of resistance for the Ukrainians, because, the reason that the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to Soledar tooth and nail, even though it's now under Russian control, and why the Russians are expecting an offensive from Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, is because the Ukrainians know that if Soledar collapses, the Russians will be able to encircle Bakhmut, and once Bakhmut collapses, that'll be catastrophic for Ukraine. So, this is the most honest part of this article we've seen here for sure. UK's intelligence said in its daily assessment on January 10th that it believes Russia's Soledar axis is likely an effort to envelop the nearby city of Bakhmut from the north and to disrupt Ukrainian lines of communication. The British says that in the last 4 days, Russian and Wagner forces have made tactical advances into the historic salt mining town and are likely in control of most of the settlement. So we're getting a lot of honest reporting there from the British. So that's good to see. That's definitely good to see. Again, it seems that the Americans and the Ukrainians are the ones that try to downplay all of this and don't necessarily report on the situation based on the reality. They always try to downplay the reports, and they're always behind purposely as compared to what everybody else is saying. They suggested that each side was likely concerned about the possible use by the enemy of 200 kilometers of disused tunnels from the Soledar mine running underneath the city. The Ukrainian military previously said Russian forces redeployed to Soledar after failing to take the larger nearby town of Bakhmut. Bakhmut and Soledar lie in the Donetsk region of eastern Ukraine, which Putin claims to have annexed. Full control of it and the neighboring Luhansk region, the so-called Donbass, is Russian President Vladimir Putin's main priority at this stage in the war, analysts have said. But again, the Ukrainians aren't going to stop their fighting. According to them, they plan on retaking all of this that Russia has already conquered. So the Russians, like I've covered in other videos, seem to understand this. They seem to understand that, as long as Zelensky's there, he's pretty much just going to be a puppet of America and NATO. And, they've stated that they consider this a conflict now against the United States, NATO, and the British. Now, according to all these reports and everything we've seen up until now, it seems that Ukraine is going to be defeated. They're going to collapse. Unless the Americans, the British, and NATO come in to the rescue. How? With soldiers, with boots on the ground. How? By sending Ukraine their best tanks, the best American tanks, the best British tanks, the best NATO tanks, the best American fighter jets, the best British fighter jets, and the best NATO fighter jets, which are essentially the American and the British ones. Ukraine has been asking for those weapons for a while Russians keep on advancing and taking control, while at the same time suffering major losses, right? The Ukrainians are saying, hey, guys, what are you waiting for? We need these weapons, like, now. And America and NATO have said no, because they fear a risk of escalation. How much more can it escalate than this, you ask? Nuclear weapons, mutually assured destruction. That's the only reason that's preventing the Americans and NATO from stepping inside of Ukraine. So what are they doing? They are using Ukraine as a proxy to inflict as many casualties as they can to the Russians, because they know they will eventually, in the future, have to fight them head on. Now, that's when I believe we'll have a World War III scenario, as the Bible prophesies the end of the world. But that's why I also believe it's not going to take place over Ukraine. Now, that is just my belief, according to my faith, according to the Bible, and according to the situation going on. I'm not saying there couldn't be the use of nuclear weapons, small tactical nuclear weapons. That could certainly be the case. But I don't think, World War III is going to start over Ukraine. I think this was sort of the catalyst, right, for what will eventually be that major war that, most people of the world fear, right? Armageddon. But anyways, the truth is stranger than fiction. So there it is, guys. We got to keep a close eye right now, on that city there of Soledar. And we have to keep a close eye and see if the Ukrainians do launch an offensive here, one last major offensive to try and retake Soledar. If they don't, because they just don't have the capacity now, and they make the decision that it'll be better to reserve all those units for the next battles here in Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, or if they try to send reinforcements to Bakhmut rather, then I think we're going to see a major maneuver here, a pincer movement towards Bakhmut, and then the Russians will try to encircle Bakhmut. But anyways, that's just my analysis of the situation. Sorry about those notifications here. Those are from Messenger. Let me know your thoughts and opinions, guys. Again, this is just my opinion. I know you might differ, and I'd like to hear what you think about all of this. Leave your comments down below. Make sure you give the video a like, and make sure you subscribe for future content. Anyways, have a wonderful day, and God bless.